populism was very effective. As I said, Gezi events, elections, coup attempt, and so on. And we collected the speeches, and in some of our papers, we are comparing the leaders' speeches and how they match with the supporters' feelings. In some of the papers, we are looking at how the populist supporters view other groups, other groups, and how the other groups see the populists and the leaders. So this paper is one of the project's papers. It specifically looks at the BJP and Turkey's Justice and Development Party. And our second project, sorry, I forgot the ad. Our second project looks at diasporas. So in this project, we only chose two populist examples, religious populist or civilizational populist cases. One is Turkey and the other one is India. Hindutva populism, and Turkish one, as you know, is Islamist populism. And we are in this one looking at how these populist rulers, authoritarian populist rulers, are using digital technologies to export their populist narratives and emotions to diasporas, and how these narratives impact on these diaspora populations. So similar to our previous project, here we are also looking at intergroup emotions, because Ana Maria is a social psychologist and also a digital humanities scholar. So we look at how these different groups, populist supporters versus others, have been impacted emotionally and also cognitively from these narratives, populist narratives that were exported abroad. So this paper looks at the restorative nostalgia and how the leaders and the supporters look at this issue. The longing of the lost empire, the glorious past, etc. Over to you.
Can everyone hear me, please?
Hello.
Well, I'll talk now about a particular paper.
Well, thank you very much. I'll talk now about this particular paper. We'll leave that one up. So this paper in particular explores the relationship between populism and restorative nostalgia. We'll talk about that concept in a moment. In Turkey and India, and among supporters of the present ruling right-wing populist parties in those nations respectively. We're here, of course, talking about India's BJP and Turkey's AKP. The basic premise of this paper is to test the idea, which is in some of the literature, that populists, and particularly right-wing populists, often evoke the idea of nostalgia for a golden age, when society was just and moral, and when government represented ordinary people and not just elites. Now, we think this longing may form what one calls restorative nostalgia, and this is in contrast to her concept of reflective nostalgia, which involves acceptance that the past is past and cannot return. Restorative nostalgia, by contrast, attempts to recreate the past. Could we change this? Let's do that. So, this paper tests whether BJP and AKP supporters feel and express restorative nostalgia, or merely reflective nostalgia, or if we really can't tell the difference, in fact, or no nostalgia at all. The key question in the paper is, does populist leader rhetoric inspire a desire to recreate our lost civilization, or merely inspire reflective nostalgia to the past golden age? In other words, do people really feel in these particular countries and among supporters of these right-wing populist parties a desire to go back to the golden age, particularly a golden age of a great civilization, or do they not feel that very strongly? nostalgia. We ask them how they feel, do they just reflect upon it, or do they really want to recreate it at some level, whether they're going back, or maybe just taking on parts of that past and recreating it in the present and future. Someone's already talked a bit about how we did this. We did this through in-depth interviews and surveys conducted with supporters of these parties in 2003. I think I might just skip through the method of results and talk about it, and we can circulate a document to those particularly interested later if need be. Okay, so let us go to what we found. We found nostalgia to be a common emotion expressed across both groups studied, including reflective but especially restorative nostalgia. Now this was done using in vivo software and having someone manually read through all the interviews and, as we say, code them in a particular way to draw out expressions of nostalgia and then to categorise them in terms of them being either reflective, restorative, ambiguous, or nostalgia. 94% of AKP supporters expressed nostalgia of some kind, and that was 49 out of the 52 people we interviewed. Of those AKP supporters expressing nostalgia, 67.3% expressed restorative nostalgia, while only 20.4% expressed gloomy, reflective nostalgia. There was another 6 there, about 12%, who expressed nostalgia in an ambivalent nature. Could you move on to that slide? So the most common theme of nostalgia, of course, I guess unsurprisingly, was for the Ottoman Empire among AKP supporters. This was the overwhelming theme, this desire to, in some way, restore the empire. And this, of course, reflects a key theme in Erdogan's and the AKP's rhetoric, the notion that the Ottoman Empire was a sort of a golden age which was betrayed by some elites, but mainly by foreigners and other people who brought that civilization low and destroyed it. In fact, Erdogan teaches his followers, if we put it in those terms, that the Ottoman Empire was at times an almost utopian society of peace, prosperity, and diversity as well. The excesses of Western civilization did not exist there. Shall we move on to the next slide? So, when we examined AKP supporters' views, we found that a desire to see the Ottoman Empire return to its former glory is not entirely correlated with a desire to see the literal Ottoman Empire return, including the Caliphate. About 42% of AKP supporters said they wished to see the Caliphate return. But even there, exactly what they meant was sometimes a little bit ambiguous. Mostly we found that they're nationalists, but they're very wedded to the idea of the greatness of the Ottoman Empire. And even those who spoke of the need for Muslims to unite globally under a caliphate, they were very adamant that this person should be a Turk. So you can see that there's always some kind of Turkish nationalism. Next slide, thank you. So nostalgia for the Ottoman Empire did not mean AKP supporters wished to see the caliphate return and the Turkish Republic transformed into a literal copy of the empire. They were nostalgic for an idea, the elements of the empire, its grandeur, the respect it gave Turkish people around the world, the manner in which it was able to unite and protect Muslims globally. We have a few examples of statements given by supporters, so we will not bias them. So, asked if the empire should return, AKP 15 says, Allah willing it will be established, and others willing we want and we believe. Another one says that the AKP government is good because it follows in the footsteps of the Ottoman Empire. And some are very emotional about it. If you ask them what they feel about it, they will say they miss it, they love it, and they wish it could be established. And it should be re-established. And I think there's a physical manifestation of this, or at least one very obvious one, of the restorative nature of this nostalgia, which is the conversion of the Hagia Sophia back into a mosque. This is something that the supporters were telling us a huge milestone, but they're actually witnessing the silverite, they're very happy about it. So we shall move on now to the BJP supporters. I'll try to be as succinct as I can. We found it to be a bit less nostalgic in general, and more likely to express reflective nostalgia than AKP supporters. If there was a common theme, it was longing for something called the Ram Raja. So here we're talking about a kind of mythological period as described in the Ramayana, this famous Hindi text in Sanskrit. And this term also could mean an ideal society. But it's very much Hindu society. So we find that politicians have in the past used this term Raja in different ways. But the BJP links it very much to Hindu nationalism and to an exclusive kind of Hindu idea of Indian society. Thank you very much. So, perhaps a very popular physical manifestation, if we can put it that way, of this restorative nostalgia pushed by the BJP, and which ordinary BJP supporters seem to respond to here, is this conversion, whatever is the right word, the building of a temple to Rama on the site of a very famous mosque destroyed by the Indian mob in 1992. And this was an illegal act, but it's an act that is quite popular among BJP supporters who see it as a way of Hinduising India and returning India to this great civilization that it was in the past where Hindus ruled and where there were no Muslims. We see some quotes up there from BJP supporters. Next slide, please. And here we see BJP United, who I guess is quite reflective of the sort of restorative nostalgia mindset. He says he believes in returning to the past, to the Ram Raja, and that in fact the BJP government is leading India back towards this glorious past along with its other sister organisations. And here we see a few more quotes. So, we're going to the final slide now. What can we learn from this particular paper? Well, our study shows that a majority of AKP's and BJP supporters that we interviewed accept and approve of what we might call a civilizational restorative agenda of their respective leaders and parties. We did find that AKP supporters are a little bit more nostalgic and a little bit more enthusiastic, shall we say, about this particular project. And it suggests that maybe Moy was correct in her argument that restorative nostalgia is an important element in right-wing populist programs, and that the myth of the golden age and the promise of its restoration can be used effectively to mobilise people to support right-wing populist parties. It also demonstrates that encouraging the nostalgia from past golden age of great civilisation by populists can be a very successful rhetorical strategy that helps populist leaders win elections, legitimise the marginalisation of minorities, delegitimise opposition parties, but also help keep them in power over time. It's a different way of practising perhaps populism, because once you're in power, it's very hard to remain populist. But if you can say, well, we're trying to recreate this golden age of the past, and these cultural elites and so forth, and the secularists are getting in the way, well, perhaps you can continue to practice populism even while in power, which is, I think, perhaps what everyone might be doing. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Nicholas. Really fascinating insights there, and raises a lot of important questions, I think. I can't help, particularly in line with the theme of the conference, but also some of your findings, to be thinking about what are the implications of this for how we approach the and rightly so, I would say. But when these leaders seem to be encouraging a nostalgia for this kind of civilizational thinking, what are we to make of that, and how does that then, maybe we need to be going back to and thinking in a bit more of a nuanced way about the impact of this thesis. Let's park that thought, and really looking forward to this next paper as well. I'll hand over to Matthew Belanger.
Okay. Hello everyone, my name is Matthew Belanger and I am a lecturer at the University of Stirling in Scotland, and today I will be presenting a study that is in progress. So actually, in the spirit of academic inquiry, I would be very open to any feedback from the audience or interpretations. So this study is one of our first investigations focusing on the emotional dimensions of civilizationist populism. And today I'll be presenting a comparative study covering Erdogan, Modi, and Khan using a transformer-based classification. Next slide. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge the Australian Research Council's funding of our work under the following discovery grants. Next slide. So civilizationist populism, specifically in the cases that we're looking at today, Turkey, India, and Pakistan, frequently relies on emotionally charged rhetoric to mobilize support and to justify exclusionary narratives. Emotions such as pride, fear, and anger are strategically deployed to construct a sense of existential threat to the respective nation's cultural or religious identity. And this emotional framing reinforces a dichotomy between an idealized in-group and an out-group. And in this context, emotion functions as a mechanism of political persuasion and identity construction. Next slide. So anger, particularly in responses to crises or perceived threats, has been shown to significantly predict support for populist attitudes. And this response is often based on a broader sense of discontent with political elites and societal conditions. Populist movements exploit such emotions to frame existing institutions as corrupt and unresponsive to the will of the people, and as a result, emotional disaffection becomes a key driver of populist appeal and mobilization. Next slide. Fear and insecurity also contribute to the appeal of far-right and civilizationist populism. Such movements often amplify perceived threats to cultural identity, national security, or societal cohesion. And if a political leader frames these issues as urgent or existential, then populist actors mobilize fear to justify exclusionary policies and to consolidate support. So, populist messages tend to be more emotionally charged and persuasive than non-populist messages, particularly in their capacity to mobilize support. Emotional appeals have been shown to serve as mediators of this efficacy. And as a result, populist communication translates into political engagement and alignment. So essentially, exploiting real anxieties of the people and using these threats by playing on their emotions could be how populists are so effective in mobilizing support. So populist narratives frame politics as a moral struggle, you may have heard, between the good people and the corrupt elites, or the foreign others, using emotionally charged storytelling to activate intergroup dynamics and status concerns. These narratives derive power from their content, but they also rely a lot on the audience's uptake and reproduction. Because, as the listener's emotions make the story more persuasive, and ultimately this can be consequential. Emotion is therefore embedded within populist discourse. Next. So, next slide, please. Right, so existing research has started to investigate the role of emotions in generating support for populism, but there is limited exploration of how this operates across both Western and non-Western contexts. The intersection of religion, as we heard earlier, is also remaining underexplored. Comparative analysis is further lacking across different variants of populism, including Islamic, Christian, and Hindu forms. And the first and the last points here are what this current study aimed to address, or at least contribute to. So we are presenting a comparative analysis in a non-Western context. Next slide. So we aim to conduct a longitudinal comparison of the emotional dimension of the speeches of Erdogan of Turkey, Modi of India, and Khan of Pakistan using transformer-based emotion classification. We then investigated the similarities and the differences in how each leader deploys emotion within their political rhetoric over the course of 10 years. We have then examined how the use of emotion has evolved over time, specifically in response to specific political events or crises. Next. So speeches delivered by Erdogan, Modi, and Khan were collected, focusing on these national events within each country. All the speeches were translated into English by native speakers of the respective language, and the emotional tone of each sentence within each speech was classified using the Paul Emo M. DeBerta 2 model, which identifies 8 emotions, so anger, fear, disgust, sadness, joy, enthusiasm, pride, and hope. Next slide. So our data set has over 103,000 sentences from Erdogan, covering political events like the Gezi Park protests, the AKP corruption scandal, multiple election cycles, the 2016 coup attempt, and the constitutional referendum. Modi's corpus includes over 181,000 sentences, including events like demonetization, the Citizenship Amendment Act, again, multiple election cycles, the revocation of Jammu and Kashmir's autonomy, COVID lockdowns, and more. And Khan's dataset is comparatively smaller, but we do have 27,000 sentences spanning 2013 to 2018 general elections, the Azadi March, Panama Papers case, as well as addresses to the UN. We use the open source model, Paul Emo M. DeBerta 2. This is a transformer-based emotion classifier developed by Vidman and Vick in 2023, and it was trained on nearly 20,000 crowd-labeled political sentences. And as I mentioned previously, it identifies anger, fear, disgust, sadness, joy, enthusiasm, pride, and hope. These are commonly expressed in political discourse. And what is good about this model is that it is fine-tuned to be able to detect these emotions within complex political texts. So just for the benefit of those who may be new to this method, a transformer-based emotional classifier essentially understands language by analyzing each word in the context of all the other words in a sentence, and then it can then assign a value between 0 and 1 to represent the likelihood or reflect the intensity of each emotion expressed in that text. And this explanation really is simplified, but essentially the model uses patterns that it has pre-learned from large data sets to then estimate how strongly each emotion is present once we present it with new data. So these are Erdogan's results, and of the total sentences, about 25%, give or take, were classified into one of the 8 emotions. Among the classified sentences, anger was the most frequent, accounting for 34.8% of the emotional classifications. This accounted for 8.9% of his total sentences. Other prominent emotions included pride, joy, enthusiasm, and hope. Fear, sadness, and disgust were less common. And we can see longitudinally that Erdogan's use of anger does appear to be decreasing over time. So that is represented, can we go to the previous slide? That is represented by the top line, which is yellow. Okay, so next slide. So his anger is also mixed with messaging of joy, hope, and pride, and this could suggest that he's using a bit of a dual strategy in Turkey. So as we know, anger mobilizes support by emphasizing shared grievances and perceived threats, and emotions like joy and hope and pride can encourage unity and a sense of collective purpose. So Erdogan does appear to balance these, addressing both conflict and encouraging solidarity within the supporter base. So these are Modi's results, and they actually painted a very similar yet very different picture. Again, about 22% of his sentences were classified, and among the classified sentences, anger was also the most prevalent emotion, constituting 36.7%. Joy and pride were also significant, along with enthusiasm, and again, fear, sadness, and disgust were not as frequent. So this is very similar to Erdogan. However, we notice Modi's anger always appeared to be at its peak during the election years, and these are denoted by the rectangles. Then, during his term, his anger drastically declines, and these are replaced with more positive emotions, which are denoted by the oval shape. Next slide. So Modi's emotional strategy in general closely matches Erdogan's, with anger as the dominant emotion. However, Modi's rhetoric appears to have a relatively higher proportion of joy and pride compared to Erdogan, which first suggests a stronger emphasis on positive emotions to possibly reinforce group identity and optimism. And interestingly here, anger peaks only around the election cycles. So it's likely that Modi is capitalizing on these mobilization and consolidation phases, perhaps using anger strategically to garner support. And finally, we have Imran Khan's speeches, and though these are based on a smaller data set, we do interpret them cautiously. Once again, we can see here that anger is overwhelmingly dominant, comprising 59% of his classified sentences. This is a much higher proportion of anger compared to the other two leaders. Positive emotions like joy and enthusiasm and pride also appear less frequently. So, Khan's strategy is fairly consistent over time. There is one year in 2020 where we see some increases in positive emotions, but again, we do not have a lot of data here, so we are interpreting the results cautiously. During the vote with no confidence and his subsequent arrest, we can see an increase in anger as well. So we have all three leaders predominantly using anger in their rhetoric. Khan's rhetoric stands out as most dominated by anger, and Erdogan's appears to balance this anger with appeals to cultural pride and resilience. Modi's rhetoric is comparatively more optimistic and perhaps developmental, and anger is seemingly used or intensified primarily around the election periods. So now we're just going to have a look at some interesting shifts in the use of emotion based on specific political events that occurred during that year. So in 2016, Erdogan's speeches showed quite an increase in sadness and fear, in addition to a decline in expressions of hope. And this shift could be due to the impact of the attempted coup, during which there were tanks on Istanbul's bridges and bombings in Ankara, rapid counter-actions by civilians and loyal forces. The aftermath included over 250 deaths, thousands of injuries, and a large-scale purge of more than 50,000 alleged Gulenists within state institutions. So this atmosphere of crisis was seemingly captured in the emotional tone of Erdogan's rhetoric during this period. For Modi, anger was lowest in 2022, where joy and pride peaked as well. During 2022, there were state-led bulldozer justice actions targeting opposition communities, and the bulldozers have since become a symbol of the divisive and violent brand of retributive justice which is endorsed by Modi. And again, data is limited for Khan in 2020, but he was primarily focusing on the foundation of new education plans and dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic during this time, which could explain the uptick in positivity. Later periods include the no-confidence motion, followed by his arrest and subsequent political aftermath, so we can again see the uptick in anger there. So now I just wanted to reflect a little bit on some of the implications of what we have found. First and foremost, anger emerges as the most consistent emotion across all three leaders, and this confirms its central role in civilizationist populist discourse. Looking at the speeches, this anger is predominantly directed outward toward perceived outgroups like the Western elites and secular liberals, minorities, immigrants, rather than inward or even diffusely at society. And this aligns with the core binary framework of civilizationist populism, which constructs the pure people as threatened by morally corrupt others. Anger functions as a polarizing emotion that these leaders skillfully use to their advantage over time. At the same time, other emotions like pride and hope can be used to kind of complement the contrast between the in-group and the out-groups and foster unity and mobilization within the populist base. So being emotionally hybrid allows the leaders to spread a dual narrative of grievance but also revival. Interestingly, each leader exhibits very similar profiles of the most dominant emotions, but they also display distinct emotional variants or use cases. So I would say future steps would be to really explore the use of emotions perhaps before, during, and after certain events to kind of uncover distinctive strategies or changes. This would also be heavily dependent on the type of event that occurs. So for example, the COVID-19 data could be a very good basis for comparison. For example, because this event has affected all of the leaders at the same time, and so they're operating within that same timeline. Overall, as we know, civilizationist populism is highly responsive to political events, and here we can see the leaders adapting their emotional rhetoric according to, for example, election cycles, unrest, and crises, and this really demonstrates that emotion is indeed a foundational tool in sustaining and advancing their agendas. Yeah, just here are some references that appeared in the presentation, and that, next slide. Yeah, that concludes the presentation, and I wanted to thank you for your attention.
Before we open up for questions, I just wanted to check in with Bliuc, who is connected with both projects, and see whether you want to add anything. So we have roughly 20 minutes available for questions for our next speaker. And while you're all collecting your thoughts and putting your questions together, I just want to throw a couple of things out there that struck me. So in addition to this rethinking or re-critiquing of the clash of civilizations, a First of all, I wanted to really congratulate all the speakers on, and the authors of the papers for giving us this deep dive on emotions in populism. I think it's a really important topic and one that we really need more in-depth analysis of. I was curious about, and to ask both the authors of both papers, what they think the link is between the emotion of anger that was so prominent in the second paper and restorative nostalgia that came out so prominently in the first paper, particularly because in the second paper you were mentioning revival as something that was quite a common narrative as well. So is there a link there? And if there is, what might that link be? And then one of the other things I was thinking about, in both cases with the different contexts that you're looking at, I'm wondering about the role that collective trauma plays in creating a kind of breeding ground for populism and for the generating these kinds of emotions of grievance and of anger, particularly directed towards external parties, that can be tapped into as part of the rhetoric of these populist leaders. So that's a couple of thoughts from me. I'll give you guys some time to think about that while we open up for questions. Have we got some questions from the room? Oh, lots of questions. Excellent. Do we have a roving mic? Do we have a roving mic? No? Can I? Okay, I'm going to be annoying and I'm going to make you all stand up. So, because we don't have the roving mic, and it does help if... Oh, hang on, do we? We do have the roving mic. Okay, great. So, can I see the hands again, please? Okay, lady on the front row was first.
Thank you very much. Really interesting presentations. My name is Irina Fenriza. I am the chair of ECPS. I just wanted to ask you two questions, if I may. The first one is regarding the role of social media in reinforcing some of these emotional impacts that we've seen. Have you looked at this in your study specifically based on the role of emotions, particularly as far as echo chambers and confirmatory bias is concerned? Does that actually make it more pronounced? And the second question is regarding the use of these emotional triggers. Why is it only populists, do you think, that are using this? And is this maybe something that we as mainstream politicians, or maybe I should talk for myself, I as a mainstream politician should have a look at and how we can better utilize these kinds of tools? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take one more question and we'll hand it back to the panelists.
Yeah, thank you very much for this exciting presentations and huge data about the emotions. I want to make a bit populism, like putting emotions versus reason. But my question is actually how different religious leaders, not religious, but those leaders who abuse religions or identity, using Islam. Islam means peace and traditionally suggests tolerance and togetherness. And Hinduism is, we know, Hinduism with the Gandhi, again, proposing peaceful coexistence. How they could use this religious understanding and identity issues as a legitimizing element to create fear or create anger or create some negative feelings among their followers. This is my first question. The second question is that when we hear about the restorative nostalgia, we could easily understand what does it mean. But could you make a bit elaborate this reflective nostalgia? What does it mean? And what kind of results it gives us? Thank you.
Who wants to have the first go?
So the first question, connection between nostalgia and anger. these are interconnected, nostalgia and anger. Why? Because especially these populists, how they frame this, we lost our empire. Why? Because of this corrupt elite, internal enemies. They were so corrupt, they were so bad to external enemies, the British, Zionists, whatever. They simply used them as pawns and puppets, so they destroyed us from within. That's why we lost the Ottoman Empire. Otherwise, there was nothing wrong with Ottoman. It was so glamorous, magnificent, so big, so powerful. They didn't make any mistakes, they didn't miss the Nazi revolution, everything was fine, but it's always the work of the outside enemies. You can call it superior mind or whatever, so they are connected. You are angry, why? Because you lost your empire, because of corrupt elite, because of these external enemies and internal minorities. They revolted against Ottoman Empire while everything was peaceful. They were living in a democratic society as equal citizens, everything so nice for all these Christians and Jews, and suddenly, because of the imperialists, we lost our empire. So there is anger there, and the populists use this. This is how they manufacture history, and they try to create this imaginary history and imaginary communities. And the second question, connection with trauma, definitely, because these are traumatic events. I'm not saying that they are 100% fabricated. Of course, Ottomans lost their territories, more than 2 million people lost their homes, they had to migrate to Anatolia. So there are traumatic experiences, but the framing of these events, just looking at it from a certain lens, blaming others and taking not any responsibility, and blaming just for the elites, but not looking at the factors. So definitely trauma is there, and into trauma, we have also victimhood, which is heavily used by populists, and sometimes there is this concept of competitive victimhood, and resulting norms can be given. But the populists exaggerate these things, and when you hear them, you think that these people were tortured and they were not really free, etc. And then they are after revenge, and when they focus on their victimhood only, they don't have any mental space and energy to think about the Kurds and Alevis. We asked them these questions in the interviews, and I read all of the interviews done with the more than 130 people in Turkey, especially. So, and actually, a book came out as a result of some of these interviews from my previous project, not this one, and you see the competitive victimhood, that focusing only your victimhood, not the others, is very high with the ECPS supporters. And this is based on studies done on Israel. So some Israeli scholars also found actually they developed the concept of competitive victimhood, speaking about some Jewish people and asking them about traumas, victimhood, etc. Because of the Holocaust, they don't want to see anything that's happening to Palestine. So it's a kind of universal thing. Elina, I missed your first question. I was writing the. Anyway, I'll move on to the second one. Why only populists use this? Why not others? Actually, everybody's using it. Now, even I'm using my emotions, maybe not in a subtle way. So we are all passionate about what we do, and as politicians, I'm sure you use emotions a lot. It's part of our life, so using it is not a terrible thing. But what the populists do, they use it to demonize and sacretize media network, you can frame this easily. So one scholar can just look at the peace side, but the other scholar would easily find you 2,000 verses talk about fighting against the infidels and just going after them, etc. So it's easy. Say for Hindu, for Buddhism, if you go to Myanmar, yeah, you see how Buddhism operates there. I'll stop here.
Just to remind the panelists, we do have some more questions in the room, so if we can keep.
I just quickly start answering Helena's question about the potential role of social media. And I just want to say that we actually have another study where we looked at how emotions and leader speeches, and we looked at Erdogan, might be transmitted into the audience, like the audience and supporters. So that's another study that Matt is doing. And one of the first findings was that anger was used with speeches of Erdogan, and then was really amplified in the discourse of the audience, like his supporters. And yes, I just want to say anything more about that study.
Thank you. Yeah, that's actually a really good point to bring up that study. So the study is also a work in progress, and using topic modeling, we identified 15 different rhetorical constructs, or you could also call them devices that are used by Erdogan in his speeches from our data set. And then using another type of classification, we then compared how frequently they appeared within the interview data of his supporters as well as in his speeches. And we were kind of using this a bit as a proxy measure of transmission. It's not a measure of direct transmission from leader to follower, but we were interested to see the extent to which they internalize and perhaps reproduce these kinds of rhetorical devices. And so we identified things like anger, which appeared in the form of threat messaging, as well as unity messaging as well. Nostalgia was present, and even different constructs like discussing transportation developments and healthcare and different policy solutions. And really what was interesting was what we found had to do with anger, which the grassroots supporters basically took all of the anger and then they really amplified it quite a bit. And then comparing that to, for example, something more positive like unity messaging, this appeared half as frequent in the supporters' discourse compared to Erdogan. So even though Erdogan is saying things like that denote unity, it's not really being reproduced in the everyday conversations of his supporters. Whereas things like anger is just completely there and actually amplified by the supporters. And we definitely are interested in the role of social media as well, and that's actually going to be one of our future studies. We're going to, well, let's just say we're very interested in it, and we're going to be analyzing that definitely.
Well, I'll be very brief. On reflective and restorative nostalgia, I think the key difference, and I don't mind that I would say this, and then I didn't, so I thank you for reminding me. One prompts action, and the other doesn't. And that's really the key here. When we're in nostalgia, usually it's a kind of ambivalent emotion, there's some warm feelings, but it's quite personal. Usually, when it becomes collective, it may change a little bit, but there's a particular idea here in restorative nostalgia where action is being prompted by the nostalgia. I think that's really the key difference here. That a politician can use nostalgia in this way as to create action. It doesn't mean the action will be good or bad necessarily, but that I guess question, do non-populists, or supporters of non-populist parties today feel nostalgic? I think I had Ralph on it, and I'm only looking at Pakistan, but we've looked at a few other countries in the future, and hopefully we will. And we find that they do feel nostalgic. And what's interesting is sometimes they feel a kind of restorative nostalgia, but it works a little bit differently. I look at Pakistan, and the supporters of the Pakistan People's Party think that you can anyone populist, but I mean I would generally consider in the context of the Pakistani politics a left-wing party. They have socialist leanings that are in the past, but of course this is the in the country, and so the supporters of the PPP did sometimes express an almost restorative nostalgia for earlier periods of Islamic history, but they sort of understood them as being Muslims lived in socialism.